A very warm welcome to all participants of today's AES Speaker event. I hope all of you are doing well and have a great start into the new week. My name is Matthias and I will be today's host. That being said, I am delighted to welcome our guest speaker of today, Frank Sieren, live from Hong Kong. Good afternoon, Frank, and thanks for taking the time. Before I properly introduce our guest, let me briefly say a few sentences about the Asian European Society Munich. We are a non-profit Munich-based student society that aims to foster the mutual understanding between students from Asia and Europe. And therefore, our team of roughly 30 people organizes a broad range of events, such as today's one. So to all the Munich students out there, I highly encourage you to reach out to us in case you want to be part of this community. You can learn more about us by visiting our website aesmuc.de or by following us on our social media channels. That being said, for those of you who do not know Frank yet, I would say a few sentences about him. I hope you do not mind if I briefly read it out. Frank is one of Germany's leading experts on China. The journalist, book author, and documentary filmmaker has been living in Beijing since 1994. And wrote about the developments in the Middle Kingdom for leading German press such as Wirtschaftswoche, Handelsblatt, and Die Zeit. Further, he also published several best-selling books on China, with his most recent one, The Future ? China! Which is also the reason why our event of today is called like that. And in 2006, he also co-authored the book Neighbor China with former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, in which the two men talk about Schmidt's very personal China experience, as well as unpublished meeting records with CCP leaders such as Mao and Deng Xiaoping. Before we start our conversation, let me finally elaborate on the structure of today's session. We will start off by talking about Frank's personal China experience. Then we will go over a little bit back in time and talk about China's history and development, before we look at current challenges and a future outlook. So from the beginning on, all of you are encouraged to ask questions. You can do that by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and submit the questions, and we will try to cover as many as possible. Again, Frank, thanks for being our guest today. We really appreciate it, and we are excited to hear your thoughts. Also recorded, perfect. Let me start off on a personal note, Frank. As just mentioned, in 1994, you came as one of the first Western business journalists to China. Can you maybe briefly describe to our participants what you found there when you first arrived in China, and also what unique aspects of China caught you in a way that you would not leave the country for 25 years?
I came there basically by accident. There was no big plan behind it. There was no plan to become a China specialist. And I was simply fascinated about these people. 94 people were basically, they had left behind 89, the Tiananmen incidents, and they were starting again. And it was a quite optimistic mood, and quite a lot of curiosity, and even a kind of an American dream, the idea that they can build something. And they had a lot of questions. And in these times, I learned a lot dealing with them, not only about the rising China, but also about the advantages and disadvantages of the Western societies. And this was quite interesting. So I stayed there. And today it's still interesting, 25 years later.
Thanks, Frank, for this. So yeah, you just mentioned 25 years later, it's still interesting. You experienced basically 4 eras of Chinese leaders, from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping. Can you lead us maybe a little bit through that time, like briefly, and tell us a bit how you personally also perceive this last 3 decades of extraordinary change in China? Also, maybe which era you particularly found memorable in your experience?
Actually, the most important impression is that nearly anyone was seeing this coming, was seeing how successful China would be within this 20 years. It was always clear that they're going to make it because they have strong traditions, they're an old country, and they want to rejoin the modern economy and all these kind of things. But over all this time, China was mostly underestimated. And so my big learning in this 20 years is not to try to underestimate China for the coming 20 years. Because basically, the last 20 years, what they did, they mostly rebuilt what we invented, what we achieved. And they learn how to rebuild it, they learn how to build modern cars, modern machines, and suddenly 7, 8 years ago, they started to invent their own technology. And probably the last 20 years have been very, very interesting, but I assume that the next 20 years, when they rely on their own innovation, will be even more interesting, and the influence of China will become even bigger. So for most of the people, for most of my friends I know in China, it's a tremendous change of their lifestyle, even of their freedom. Not all kinds of freedoms, but of their personal freedom to decide what do they want to learn, where do they want to travel, where do they want to move. There's still a lot of freedoms which are not allowed yet, like press freedom, like the freedom of building up your own party and so on. But for most of the people, it's an extreme success in their personal lives. And so if there are crises coming, and actually in the last 20 years, you could roughly say every 10 years there was a big crisis, starting with 89, then 97, the Asian crisis, then the dot-com crisis, then 2008, 2009, the financial crisis, then in between SARS. So they learned in a way to deal with this crisis, and they probably have now a better way to deal with crisis than we have in the West, because what's happening now, it's basically getting at us by total surprise. So here in China, you can see how they leave the Corona crisis behind them, and start to continue to build up their country, to build up their businesses. And this is, for me, quite fascinating.
Thanks, Frank. Let's talk also about Corona maybe a little bit later. You just mentioned the absence of free press and also a lack of freedom of speech. So this is like, you don't have any profession, but you're like a particular one. You are a journalist. So can you maybe describe our participants how the life as a Western journalist in China looks like? How does the limitations affect your daily work as a journalist, and how has it maybe also changed over time?
Yeah, I'm not a typical case, because I'm for such a long time in China. I know a lot of people, and a lot of people are trusting me. That makes it easier than for colleagues who only come for like 3 years to Beijing to be a correspondent. And even for the Chinese colleagues, it's even more difficult, because as a foreigner, your space to do things is still a little bigger than for my Chinese colleagues. And actually, for the Chinese colleagues, it's in some ways, it got worse the last years. Their moving space was limited. It's more difficult for them to work. For me, it's kind of the same. And again, I have the advantage that I know people for a long time. So if if you build up a certain trust, it makes things easier to report. And but still, there's a lot of progress to make concerning the freedom of media, of press. We could see this in this Corona crisis. At the beginning, the censors tried to basically block all the information. It changed then quickly, end of January, but from mid of December or beginning of December until end of January, there was a strong movement by the government to block this information. And there was a lot of time lost, which would have been quite important to get to know what's going on in China.
Yeah, thanks. So before we look at the title of today's session and more look to the future, let's go a little bit back in time to the history and development of China. So many experts would argue that we need to understand China's long-lasting history and also the historical awareness of the Chinese people. Can you maybe briefly explain to our listeners what impact thousands of years of Chinese dynasties and also philosophers such as Confucius or Sun Tzu still have in contemporary Chinese mindset?
Actually, we shouldn't do this only with China. It should be quite normal with every country that we learn the country's history, because to a certain extent, the history is shaping the present and the future as well. And in the case of China, actually, it is quite important that they have been a world power already, and then they did quite a few mistakes mid of the 19th century. They were basically so stubborn or arrogant that they couldn't imagine that at the other end of the world, in England and Europe, something like the Industrial Revolution could happen. So they basically missed the Industrial Revolution and got in big trouble, because the colonial powers then had they had the bigger, the better weapons, and they could colonialize part of China. And through this pressure, China basically collapsed and had about 150 years of very difficult times. Mao at least succeeded to reunify the country. It was actually, before Mao came, it was quite likely that China is going to fall apart in different countries. And his achievement was to reunify China. But then he didn't really find a quite convincing way to develop the countries, to make sure that China is catching up with the modern development. He made his political ideas were very devastating for many people, for the country as well. And basically only when he died and Deng Xiaoping took over, China could re-emerge. And basically what Deng Xiaoping did differently than Mao Zedong was that he admitted that China and the Chinese are not strong enough to succeed on their own power, but that they would need to get help from the capitalists and the imperialists to build up the country. And Deng Xiaoping invited the foreigners to help and to build up the economy. And suddenly, within a decade, China emerged as the factory of the world, which was actually already quite surprising. And now, basically, China is able to build all products you can imagine in a quality, in the highest quality level you can imagine. And as I mentioned before, they are now starting, since a few years ago, to develop their own high-tech products, to be innovative themselves. And this is actually a quite big surprise that it came this fast. It was even a surprise for me, because I thought, and now we're talking again about the Chinese tradition, because I thought Chinese are very good in copying things. They have a tradition in copying things, but it has been a long time ago that they are quite innovative. But basically, one tipping point was that most of the Chinese researchers and developers who were very keen in the beginning of the 90s to leave the countries, to leave China, and to go to countries like America, like Silicon Valley, but also to England, to Europe, that they suddenly got the idea that they can be more successful if they come back to China, and if they're joining the rebuilding of their country. And this actually changed China a lot, and now more and more research teams are moving back because they think they can be, especially in southern China, in cities like Shenzhen, they can be more successful than in Silicon Valley. And so again, I think the most challenging times for the West are not behind us, they're still ahead of us. Because in the first 20, 25 years of the opening up of China, we basically had the technology, and the Chinese, they had the big market. And whenever we were negotiating with each other, it was it ended up in a very simple way, that the Chinese were saying, okay, we have this big market, we give you a share of our big market, so how much technology you are going to give us? And at the end of the day, it was a joint venture was about how much technology we give to China to get a share in this big market. This is how the car industry went into the Chinese market, and many other industries. Now, and this was kind of a balance of power. They had the market, we had the technology, and now we are at the beginning of a tremendous change, because China more and more has its own technology and the market on top. And for us, it's becoming more and more difficult to succeed within this new circumstance.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, first of all, for providing this very comprehensive overview on the past. But now you also already moved on to the future. So let's talk about the future. So your book, Future China, it has 9 chapters, and you basically have a close look at different China-related topics you consider crucial to understand China's current rise, but also future potential. You just mentioned, for instance, the automotive industry, but this also includes like digital technologies such as AI, domestic reforms, geopolitical topics. We will talk later about that. So let's start a little bit in the domestic thing and then go over to the more international topics. So to begin with, would you maybe like briefly start off by broadly outlining some of your hypotheses on domestic developments in China? Yeah, and then we can like look at different topics of it.
Yes, as we have not so much time, I try to keep the domestic development quite simple. I try to keep it black and white. Basically, there are 2 developments. One development is into the direction of less freedom, and if I would tell a city which suffers of less freedom, I would say Urumqi in Xinjiang, where the Muslims are treated in a very, very tough way. And on the other side, but at the same time, you have a movement to more freedom, more in the area, not so much in the area of political freedom, but more in the area of research and innovation. And if you would mention a city which is probably right now the freest city in China, I would say it's Shenzhen. It's a new Silicon Valley, it's a greater Bay Area. And both of these developments are initiated by Xi Jinping, and both, and that makes it so complicated for us, it happens at the same time, and all the other developments are kind of gray shade developments between these two poles, we can say, and are kind of in between. So what we need to understand, if you talk about the freedom in Shenzhen, which is not only a freedom talking about innovation and technology, it's also a freedom to build up a subculture, to build up clubs for electronic music, art scene, and so on, because you only can get the researchers if from Silicon Valley, if they find living conditions which are nice, which they like, and if the city gives them an environment where they want to live. So, so on the other side, the political freedom, I talked already about the press, has been narrowed. The moving space of lawyers has been narrowed at the same time. And for us in the West, it's very difficult to understand that we need to think both at the same time to understand China. So if you only talk about Xinjiang, if you only talk about the reduce of press freedom, you're only showing one part of the development. If you only talk about Shenzhen and innovation and technology, you also show only one part. And I think this is actually the most important thing we need to understand. And we do hope that the personal freedom will become bigger, but actually, as we need to see that this is, and it's very difficult to explain, but this is how it works. It's probably developing at the same time in two different ways. And I'm not sure. I can't say this is not going to be successful. I'm actually not sure about this. Probably it's going to continue for quite a while.
Thanks, Frank. Let's stick for 1 second with the Shenzhen Greater Bay Area topic and also innovation. So you just mentioned the Greater Bay Area with Shenzhen in its center. It's obvious that China needs to go more from manufacturing also into services and high-tech value chain stuff. So what is, maybe you can briefly elaborate on the role of local and central government in innovation. So do you see more the innovation happening from the government-driven, or is it also, you mentioned the researchers, the leading universities in Beijing, the big tech firms such as Tencent, Alibaba? Where do you see the limitations and advantages of China's innovation ecosystem?
It's both. The central government needs to create an environment. And then within the environment, there's a market economy kind competition. And so it both interacts. And the advantage of Shenzhen is that basically you only have foreigners in Shenzhen, Chinese foreigners, people which were moving within China to Shenzhen. So it was possible to build up this city from a scratch, and a lot of very young people came to this city. It's one of the youngest cities in the world, 10 years younger on average than Berlin. So basically, it's a mixture of government support. It's easy to get money. The government is building research clusters. But as soon as it comes to the question, what should they invent? What should they build? There's a lot of space. There's a lot of freedom to for innovation and for all kind innovation, and that's the way a company like DJI, which produces drones, emerged. That's the way like Huawei emerged, which is now the leading provider of 5G technology, and which is now selling more smartphones, and some say better smartphones than Apple. And these are only two examples. We talked about briefly about the car industry. There's 16,000 electric buses driving in Shenzhen, and more than 20,000 taxis. In Berlin, there are 4 electric buses and 2 are broken. You can see how innovation is moving in a very, very quick space, which is actually easier in a city like Shenzhen because you build it up from scratch. You're not blocked by traditional industries. It's easier to start if you can start from nothing at a small startup. But it's still for me a very, very surprising development, and this is going to challenge us in a very tough way. And we should really learn not to underestimate this new innovation which is coming from China.
Thanks, Frank. You just mentioned the automotive industry, so let me allow one last question before we move to China and the world. So in the third chapter of your book, you also talk about the future of mobility and automotive. Obviously, the German automotive industry is under heavy pressure, diesel, Corona, e-mobility. So despite the enforcement of joint ventures throughout the last year, still German car producers look back to a great success story, with Volkswagen making more than a third of its sale in China. Do you think this will change in the next years, also with regard to this concept of made in China 2025? Maybe you can also briefly elaborate on this. And
basically, there will be in the car industry not only, and we are not only talking about cars, but we also talk about the way you connect the cars with other devices and so on. I think there will be a lot of innovation coming from China for 2 simple reasons. One I mentioned already, and that's it's easiest to start innovation if you open up your small startup than to if you have to reform a huge enterprise like Volkswagen, because they are still a lot of people focused on traditional engines, and you can't lay them off all immediately. So they have no interest in an electric car. They want to build a traditional engine, and this is basically slowing you down. The other reason is that because of this very, very fast development, the pressure to find solutions, especially for traffic solution for mega cities, it's much, much higher than in the big cities in China than it is in the Western cities. Basically in Beijing, Shenzhen, most of the time you have traffic jams. I don't use a car anymore at all. I have a scooter, electric scooter, because I don't want to waste the time sitting in a traffic jam. And the pressure is getting so high that they are forced to develop very innovative solutions involving self-driving cars, involving cars which you probably don't own anymore, with cars which are knowing because of artificial intelligence when they have to be where, which are organized by huge systems and by at the end by their own experience. That's a completely different environment, and so I think the driving force of mobility in the future will be China, not only China, also some other Asian countries, talk about South Korea, talk about Japan and others. But there will be a lot of change. And already if you see how far they got, it is quite impressive. And we need to find out as soon as possible, what do we need? What do we want? And we need to react to this new competition as quickly as possible. It's not anymore like it used to be that the German or the Western car industry could decide when it was time for a new step for innovation. Now, the pressure in China is so big that suddenly the Chinese government decided, okay, we are focusing on electric cars, and then big German and international enterprises like Volkswagen, but also the American car producers were forced to jump on this train and to build much faster than they wanted to these new electric cars to be still successful on the Chinese market. It's a difficult development. It's not easy. People in China now hesitating what they should do. They're waiting which kind of car they should buy. The car market was actually shrinking 9% last year because of this in-between time where the people don't know what's going on. But the direction is very clear, and probably with this coronavirus, there are more people who want their own car, who want to be protected and don't want to use a loaded subway or a loaded bus every morning.
Thanks, Frank. So let's look a little bit at China and the world, and also the relation between China and the world. So along with China's increasing international presence, we will talk about BRI in a second. There might be also a need for new platforms of international dialogue. But unfortunately, you can see in the press, one gets the impression that the frictions between the US and China, especially, but also more in Europe, and the rhetorical escalation from both sides are a new normal. So do you think China can be fully and peacefully integrated into the new world order, or is there some kind of coexistence? And also, what does the West need to understand about China to avoid xenophobia, and the other way around?
Basically, we are watching right now, we are just at the beginning of a tremendous historical change. You actually could say that 500 years of power of the Western, you even can say white minority, are getting over, fading. And other parts of the world are more emerging. The most emerging part is actually Asia, and the leading country is China. But this is a tremendous change, and I like to compare it with the fading of the aristocrats in the nation states of the 19th century in Europe, where also a minority was setting the rules for the majority, and suddenly the majority, the entrepreneurs and the normal people, they were saying, yes, it was nice, the aristocrats, and you had some good ideas, but we want to do it differently. We want to do it our own way, and we're not going to listen to you anymore. And what we could watch, what we could see on the nation, in the nation state, the fading of the aristocrats until mid of the 20th century, it's now happening actually on a global level. So the Western minority is not strong enough for many different reasons. It's not strong enough anymore to set the rules of the world. In the beginning, it was Europe, it was the British Empire. Then in the second half of the 20th century, it was America. And now the power of America is fading. And it's actually not so surprising if you have this big picture that Washington is doing everything they can to keep their power. And lucky-wise, we need to say everything, they do everything except one thing, they start a war. We are actually in the lucky situation that the voters in America, they don't want to fight for freedom or whatever in foreign countries anymore. And as Donald Trump is listening very much to the voters, it's basically the only group he's really listening to. He's not interested to start a war, which is a very, very big relief right now. But otherwise, he's using any measure he can get hold of to pressure China. And on the other side, China is trying everything to continue to emerge, to find new friends, to build up new coalitions, to unify Asia. They are now working on a free trade zone in Asia. Basically, all the Asian countries agreed already. Only India and China have some differences, but they're going to sort out these differences as well. And so I think the power of the West is going to fade. Question is in which speed. And the power of Asia, but also of other continents, emerging market continents, will become stronger and stronger. And actually, the big surprise with this coronavirus is that it's actually weakening. It looks like that it's going to weaken the Western countries more than it is weakening the Asian countries. For the simple reason that the Asian countries, like not only China, because there it's difficult to believe the figures, but if you look at Hong Kong, if you look at Taiwan, if you look at South Korea, if you look at Japan, they all managed this crisis, this corona crisis, in a much better way. And actually, this morning I have looked at the new figures, and I have written them down here. The figures are from 1st of May. You have about more than 500 dead people per 1 million inhabitants in Spain. In Italy, you have 460. In England, you have 400. In France, you have 370. In the US, you have 190, but they are only halfway through. In Germany, only 75 dead people for 1 million inhabitants. And if you compare this to Asia, it's actually kind of scary. 5 in South Korea, Japan and China 3, Singapore 2.5, Hong Kong 0.5, Taiwan even only 0.25. So you see this big difference, and this difference, even if the figures are not 100% accurate, you can see that if you look at the figures, that Spain, which has roughly the same amount of people than South Korea, has more than 100 times more casualties than South Korea. And this means that they can re-emerge, that they can restart their economies much earlier, and that the Western countries will suffer about this for a much longer time. And this will actually accelerate the weakness of the West and the rise of the Asian countries.
Thanks for this really interesting observation, Frank. Let me follow up like one thing on this. So from a Western perspective, you already mentioned some topics. There's surely a lot to criticize about China, and the politicians and the media are getting louder. On the other hand, the business world is keeping their mouth basically shut, as you can see with NBA and luxury brands. So let me ask you in a straightforward way, how can we constructively criticize China? And are we in the position to criticize internal affairs of other countries while claiming our own sovereignty?
I think we are not in the position anymore. We used to be in the position, but we are not anymore in the position to force China to do things that they don't want, to follow a path that we want them to follow. So basically, what we need to do, we need to gain their trust, and we need to convince them. We need to be convincing that our values, our ideas, our path of development could be interesting for a country like China as well. I think unfortunately, we are already too weak to just rely on China bashing, because the Chinese have so many allies already in Asia, in Africa, in Middle and South America, that it is quite difficult for us to get majorities for a kind of policy which is not, in which the Chinese government is not interested in. Even in Europe, we basically underestimated the new Silk Roads, One Belt, One Road initiative. And we were saying, oh, this is only propaganda, and we don't have to deal with it. And suddenly, basically, the Chinese government, they were buying out one country after another. They started with Greece, then they went on with some Eastern European countries, and the latest country was Italy, actually the first G7 country which was joining the One Belt, One Road initiative. And this makes it much more difficult for us to unify Europe and to find a strong position against China. And this is actually partly our mistake, because we forced, for example, Greece to privatize their ports, but then no port enterprise in Europe wanted to take over this rundown ports until the Chinese came, and they made it a very successful port in Greece. So we made quite a few mistakes. Now our position is getting more and more difficult. That's clear. And I think what the Americans are doing right now is not sustainable on the long run. They're probably knowing it themselves, but for them it's much more important to succeed in the election campaign. And a big part of the China bashing we are seeing now is basically part of election campaign, and is partly to make sure that no one realized that they waited much too long in the Corona crisis until they reacted. Actually, they lost about 6 weeks, and so we will see how it's going to continue. If Donald Trump will be re-elected, it's quite likely that this tough approach towards China will be continued. But actually, we have to say Donald Trump was not very successful with his political initiatives. If you look at 5G, he tried to convince the half of the world not to use 5G equipment of Huawei. Basically, at the end of the day, only the Australians, New Zealand and Japan followed their paths. All of Europe and many other countries decided to use the equipment. In his Iran policy, he can't convince the Europeans. In his climate change policy, he can't convince even not other Western countries. And so he doesn't look very successful to me. And if you look at the details of the trade deal signed in January, which was actually interesting. If you watch the signing ceremony, there was on the American side, there was the American president. On the Chinese side, there was not even a prime minister. There was not the president. There was a vice premier signing this contract. This shows already the balance. Trump was not powerful enough anymore to force the Chinese to sign it on the highest possible level. And if you look at the details of the contract, there are a lot of very a lot of not very binding paragraphs in it, and but still he can sell this as a success within America, and that's probably for him the most important thing.
Thanks. Let's stick for 1 second with the Belt and Road Initiative topic.
Yes.
And what I found really interesting when I read a little bit and prepared for this session. So you also talk a lot about Africa. Together with your brother, you wrote a book on Africa called The Africa Boom. And also in 2007, you made a short documentary on Chinese ambitions for resources in Africa. You also mentioned Latin America on the other hand. So people always saying like, hey, is this a win-win situation or is this neocolonialism? Is it something in between, or would you say go for one of them?
I would say it depends on the African countries that it becomes a win-win situation. And actually, they are making progress. The African Union is making progress, setting the rules and forcing the Chinese in a same way that the Chinese forced us to produce within the country if you want to sell something in Africa. There's a huge development of localizing production, which is very, very good for African countries. I wouldn't use the term neocolonialism because at the end, colonialism means that the colonized country has no choice. It's forced to do what another country is telling them to do. And in this case, actually, we could say for the first time in African history, the African countries, the leader of African countries, they have the free choice to work with America, with Europe, with India, which is very strong in Africa, with Japan, with South Korea, or with China. Unfortunately, the offers right now are not very balanced. The Chinese are making the best offers, and actually we need to define a policy concept in Europe that we kind of matching these offers in offering packages which are supporting our values and our ideas of a long-term collaboration, of a long-term engagement. But right now, I would say for Africa, the advantages of the Chinese engagements are still bigger than the disadvantages.
Thanks, Frank. Let's switch over to some of the participants' questions we haven't integrated yet. So very straightforward question. Travis wants to know, so what's your opinion on China's decision to kick out many prominent American newspapers such as Washington Post and New York Times? Is it just another escalation, or do you see anything particular in it?
Yeah, basically it started that America kicked out news organizations in Chinese news organizations in America, saying that these are not journalists which are working there, but kind of diplomats. They had to reduce their staff. For obvious reason, I don't like it at all that my colleagues are thrown out of the country. I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think, even from a Chinese perspective, it's not a good idea, because it somehow gives us the impression that they have something to hide, and that's putting them not in a very good light. I'm in favor of the idea that you exchange as much journalists as possible. But I also think that it is very important for each other, for the journalists working in a foreign country, that you try to understand why they are behaving in the way they are behaving. And this has a lot to do, we talked already about it, with their history. Germany has a history, a very, very special history. For this reason, they do sometimes strange things, but if you understand their history, you understand why they're doing this. And it's the same thing with China. For example, if I give one example, Taiwan. Actually, you could say why you don't leave Taiwan alone, why it can't be an independent country. Yeah, it's successful. It doesn't matter for China if Taiwan is independent or not for the success of China. But if you know the history of China, if you know the fight between the communists and the nationalists, you better understand why this is happening. The same thing with Hong Kong, which used to be a British colony, I think if you better understand each other's history, we can better explain things to our readers. And this doesn't matter that I have to agree to what the Chinese do, but it makes it easier for me to understand it, and probably it's then easier to convince the Chinese or to put our position in the right way, that it can be accepted as a different position by our Chinese counterparts. I don't think all kinds of bashing are going to be successful.
Thanks, Frank. So we have another question on China's middle class. So it's obvious that China's way of poverty alleviation over the last decade was incredibly successful. But China wants to know, what do you think the middle class, do they actually benefit or suffer? Like, his hypothesis is that mainly the top 10% are accumulating wealth, whereas the middle class is still.
Yes.
Maybe you can just explain a little bit about the middle class.
Also economically, the middle class was economically, this is a success story. This is 100% clear. We were always arguing, or we were always saying that in a certain step of development, the middle class wants more freedom than only economic freedom. I personally think this is still right, but what we underestimate is that there are still 1 billion people out there who want to be part of the economic success, and they are much stronger than this quite small group of people in the coastal cities which made it already. There's one quite impressive figure. 1 billion people in China never took a plane. There you can, if you just imagine what the potential development which is still coming. So therefore, I think Chinese middle class will fight for their personal freedom, but it will take longer, because the group right now is not big enough. It's only 150 million people. And so the pressure is not big enough. There are changes, but the changes are not, they're not, how would you say, they're not successful enough. They're not convincing enough. And the reason is that we underestimate the balance of certain developments. Most of the people, they're still fighting for their economic success. and they don't care so much about free speech and about having the freedom of building up, opening up their own parties, and so on.
Thanks. Sorry for jumping so much around in the topics, but we have
no problem.
A very diverse set of questions. So Tobias wants to know, so you talked about the automotive industry, also the electronic car makers from China, such as Neo and Byton. He's asking what's the reasoning behind that the Chinese or the local government in Shanghai allowed Tesla to do this wholly owned subsidiary. So why do you think the Chinese are supporting Tesla, although they have their own e-mobility producers?
Because it's forcing their enterprises to speed up. It's very simple. They take one of the most successful producers. They give them the possibility to build up a factory, and this is speeding up competition. And but I think Chinese electric car industry will learn more from Tesla than Tesla will learn about from the Chinese electric car industry. So it's actually a very smart move, because you can say we're opening up. On the other hand, you tell your Chinese car producers, look, these are the successful guys, and if you want to be successful, you need to be able to compete with them.
Thanks. Next question. Climate change a little bit. So the most threatening problem the participant says is climate change. How do you see China's role in this? Do you think the government efforts are enough?
Actually, you always can do more, and China is in a very difficult situation. They still rely very much on coal. About 70% of the electricity production is in coal, but they're moving into the right direction. And actually, the position on climate change of Europe and China right now are much closer than Europe and America. And probably out of this surprising development, we are able to create one or the other agreement, which is helping us to fight climate change, which is right now not so much in the focus anymore because of Corona, but this is actually the much bigger problem. And as we see the drought, this third year of drought in Germany, as well as drought in China, we get an impression how big this problem is going to be. And the United States, especially its President Donald Trump, is not very helpful at this time dealing with this problem, which makes it much more difficult to find global solutions. In this case, China is much more cooperative than the Americans.
Thanks. So we are almost running out of time. We discussed before. Maybe let's just take 2 or 3 more questions and then wrap up. So maybe an interesting question from Johanna on Central Asia. We talked about the Belt and Road Initiative. Central Asia, many people do not really know what to think of Central Asia. Maybe you can briefly describe. And she's asking basically whether it's a conflicting point of cooperation between China and the European Union. So where do you see big potential in this in all the STAN countries? Or
if I would have had a wish at the beginning of the One Belt and One Road initiative, I hope that the European Union is joining the table and say, very good idea, but here's our money, but we have different ideas. We want to work with you. We have different ideas. We have different values. Let's talk about it. Let's do a joint venture. We didn't do this. Now we are in a quite defensive position as China invested heavily in these Central Asian countries, which are desperately needing investment, and it's not always 100% in favor of these countries. There's a lot of corruption going on. But still, at the end of the day, if there's a new road, if there's a new airport, if there's a new coal power plant, if there's more electricity, it's good for the people. Even if the circumstances are not state of the art or are not in a way we would like to have them. So I think we did a big mistake in waiting, in underestimating those developments, and now we need to find a way to get into this game. We need to find a way to convince this country that it is better to work with us because we have different values, because probably our approach is sustainable, but there's a competition of concepts. And this is the problem. And sometimes the Chinese concepts are more convincing, at least in the first step. So what we need to do, we need to convince them that on the long run, they are better with us. They are better if they stay with us, or they are better if they have a third party which is balancing things. But it's on our side to start it. And if you don't do it, it will be our problem. I'm quite sure that China is going to continue, probably not in this pace they did it in the last year, because the Corona crisis is slowing everything down. But at the end, to help these countries in between Asia or in between East Asia and Europe, it's not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea to help the African countries to build up their own markets.
All right. Let's take one last question and then wrap up. This question was actually asked 2 times. So it's a little bit on the biggest internal challenge of China. Where do you see the biggest problem? The participants, they're mentioning public debt, regional imbalances, demographic change. So do you think there's this one threat which could literally make the whole system implode from the inside? Or
yeah, if you would force me to answer with one word, I would say this one word, and the word is water. If China already has a big water problem. The water problem is so big that they take a lot of Mekong's water to keep it in China, and countries like Thailand, like Cambodia, like Laos already complaining that they don't have enough, like Vietnam, that they don't have enough water. If China is running out of water, it will affect the industry and the farmers at the same time. And there's no way to supply water by big boats or by pipelines in an adequate time. So the climate change topic is very, very important, much bigger than the social imbalances. That's my personal view. Because yes, China has a big debt, but China has no big foreign debt. And this is a very, very important. If you have no foreign debt, no one from abroad can force you to pay your debt. It's your internal thing, what you're doing with the debt, and at the end, it's a question of trust, if the people still trust the government. And my experience is that the trust in the government is much higher because of this recent success story with all the problems China had, but it was a success story, and the people feel in their personal life, feel that this is a success story. So if the government is making big mistakes, people are, they good for a few mistakes until the people start to go to protest and to demonstrate. So I think it's not very likely. If the government would make very big mistakes and people would get the impression that the next years are getting worse and worse, and there's no hope. I think it would be impossible for the government to stop them to go on the street and to protest. And it would be much faster with these social media we have now than it happened in 89. That's clear. But right now, I don't have the impression that China is at this point or will be at this point soon. So the biggest challenge lies on the environmental side, because no one knows how much water is already so polluted that you can't clean it anymore. And no one knows the tipping point. When these problems of climate change, and now I'm only talking about water, we can also talk about air, we can also talk about many other climate change related topics. But water is actually the most important thing, because you can live quite a long time in bad air. You can't survive if you don't have clean water. And so this could be a very, very big problem for this huge country, which only has right now the per capita income of Bulgaria. So sometimes we get the impression, oh, they're at a very high level already. No, what we see now is just the warming up. They're just starting. And the last 30 years, just the beginning. The most important years will be the next 30 years. And those kind of questions like, will there be enough water? Will China be innovative enough to feed all these people, all its people? It will be, these will be the most important questions. And I think if we don't understand this, and if we don't react to this new historical challenge in the West, we are going to have a tough time. We should immediately start to underestimate China and China's development. And we should much more focus on their strengths than on their weaknesses. Because their strengths are much more important for us than their weaknesses.
Thanks, Frank. You already perfectly wrapped up. This would have been my last question. What do you think? What steps need to be taken now in order to achieve a good outcome for both China and the world to ensure peaceful coexistence? Yeah, looking at the time, we are coming to an end. First and foremost, a big thanks to you, Frank, for taking the time being our guest today. For all of you who want to learn more about Frank's work, I can highly recommend his books, both The Future is China and also, here I'm just reading by myself, the one with Helmut Schmidt, really insightful, and also please, you can, he has a weekly newsletter, which is also quite insightful on China on his website, Sieren.net. For all of you who want to learn more about us, you know where you can find us, aesmooc.de. Thanks to all participants for joining our AES Speaker event. The next weeks will follow many exciting events. Also, you just mentioned the water topic, so I'm currently trying to find someone from the Global Water Partnership from United Nations exactly on this topic. So this would be, so stay tuned. Subscribe to our newsletter also to stay informed on future events. All of you will receive a feedback mail. We appreciate your suggestions that we can also gradually improve our webcast format. Yeah, and that being said, take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thanks again for joining, and take care of yourself, Frank, in Hong Kong, and your family.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.